Summer of 1944. Northern France. The rolling countryside that had once been peaceful farmland had become a killing ground. Within weeks, American P-47 Thunderbolts would systematically destroy over 1,000 German supply convoys, turning Wehrmacht logistics into a nightmare of burning trucks and shattered wagons. German commanders would refuse to believe the reports at first. How could single-engine fighters, armed with nothing but 50-caliber machine guns, create such catastrophic destruction? Yet the evidence was undeniable. Scorched earth stretched for miles along every major supply route. The proud German war machine, which had conquered most of Europe, found itself starving, not from lack of supplies, but from inability to move them. This was the stranglehold that would break the back of German resistance in France. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By June 1944, the situation for German forces in France had become increasingly desperate. The successful Allied landings at Normandy had caught the Wehrmacht off guard, and now American forces were pushing inland with frightening speed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood the critical weakness in German defenses. It wasn't manpower or fighting spirit, it was logistics. Every German division required tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies daily. Before the invasion, these supplies moved relatively freely along French roads and railways. Now, Allied air superiority had transformed every supply column into a potential death sentence. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated European skies, was now a shadow of its former self. German fighters rarely appeared, and when they did, they were quickly overwhelmed by swarms of American aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the most glamorous American fighter. Pilots called it the Jug because of its bulky appearance. It couldn't turn as tightly as the Spitfire or climb as quickly as the Mustang. But what the Thunderbolt could do was survive punishment and deliver devastating firepower. Each P-47 carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. These weapons, when properly harmonized, could tear through truck armor, pierce fuel tanks, and shred supply wagons with ruthless efficiency. The aircraft's radial engine, massive and powerful, could absorb incredible damage and keep flying. Pilots who flew the Thunderbolt loved it for one simple reason: it brought them home. The thick armor plating, the redundant systems, the sheer toughness of the design meant that P-47 pilots survived encounters that would have killed pilots in lighter fighters. American tactical doctrine had evolved significantly by the summer of 1944. Early in the war, fighters had been used primarily for air-to-air combat and aircraft escort, but commanders like General Airwood Quesada recognized that air superiority meant more than just shooting down enemy fighters. It meant denying the enemy the ability to move, communicate. German supply convoys that had once moved relatively freely now waited until darkness, hoping to avoid the dreaded Jabos, the German slang for fighter bombers. But even darkness provided limited protection, as American night fighters began prowling French skies. The typical German supply convoy consisted of dozens of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and occasionally armored vehicles moving ammunition and supplies toward frontline units. These convoys followed predictable routes, limited by the French road network and the need to reach specific destinations. German logistics officers tried various countermeasures. They dispersed convoys, spacing vehicles hundreds of yards apart. They added anti-aircraft guns, usually 20mm flak weapons mounted on trucks. They assigned motorcycle scouts to watch for approaching aircraft. They established elaborate camouflage protocols, covering vehicles with branches and netting during daylight hours. None of these measures proved effective against determined American pilots flying aircraft specifically designed for ground attack missions. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell flew her first combat mission over France on June 15, 1944. She was one of the few female pilots who had fought through bureaucratic resistance to fly combat aircraft. The Army Air Force had reluctantly accepted women pilots for ferry and training duties, but Sarah had proved herself exceptional. Her gunnery scores were higher than most male pilots. Her navigation was flawless. Her understanding of aircraft systems was encyclopedic. When her squadron commander needed someone for a dangerous reconnaissance mission, he chose Sarah not because of politics or symbolism, but because she was the best pilot available. That mission would change everything. Sarah was assigned to patrol a sector of roads northeast of Keene, an area where intelligence suggested heavy German traffic. She took off at dawn, her P-47 loaded with full ammunition and extra fuel tanks. The morning was clear, perfect flying weather, which meant perfect hunting weather. At 8,000 feet, Sarah scanned the French countryside below. The patchwork of fields and hedgerows stretched to the horizon. Small villages dotted the landscape, many showing damage from recent fighting. Sarah had memorized the map during her briefing, knew every road and landmark in her patrol sector. Modern warfare required more than just flying skill. It demanded tactical awareness, the ability to read terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sarah understood this instinctively. She had spent countless hours studying reconnaissance reports, learning how German forces moved and where they were most vulnerable. That preparation was about to pay dividends. Movement caught her eye. On a secondary road winding through farmland, a long column of vehicles was moving south. Sarah counted quickly. At least 40 trucks, interspersed with horse-drawn wagons and several armored cars. This was a major supply convoy, exactly the kind of target her squadron had been briefed to attack. Sarah checked her surroundings carefully. No other aircraft visible, no obvious anti-aircraft positions. The convoy was moving through open country with limited cover. It was a perfect tactical situation. Sarah armed her guns, checked her gun sight, and began her attack run. She approached from behind the convoy, staying high until the last moment to avoid giving them warning. At 2,000 feet, she rolled into a steep dive, lining up on the lead vehicles. The P-47 accelerated rapidly, air screaming past the canopy. At 500 yards, Sarah opened fire. 8 .50-caliber machine guns created a devastating stream of bullets that tore into the convoy's lead truck. The vehicle exploded instantly, its cargo of ammunition detonating in a massive fireball that sent debris flying in all directions. Sarah pulled up sharply, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat, and immediately rolled into position for another pass. Below, the convoy had erupted into chaos. Trucks were swerving off the road, trying to find cover. Soldiers were bailing out of vehicles and running for the ditches. Anti-aircraft guns were being frantically uncovered and aimed skyward. But Sarah was already lining up her second attack. She came in from a different angle this time, targeting the middle of the convoy. Her guns ripped through 3 more trucks in rapid succession. One was carrying fuel drums that exploded spectacularly. Another held medical supplies that scattered across the road. The third truck, loaded with artillery shells, detonated with such force that it created a crater in the road. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The anti-aircraft guns had found their range now. Sarah saw tracer rounds arcing toward her aircraft. She jinked hard left, then right, making herself a difficult target while maintaining pressure on the convoy. Her third pass targeted the rear vehicles, trapping the convoy between burning wrecks at both ends. The P-47's guns were merciless. Truck after truck exploded or burst into flames. Horse-drawn wagons were shredded, their terrified animals stampeding in panic. Armored cars, which might have provided some resistance, were penetrated by armor-piercing rounds that ignited their ammunition. In less than 5 minutes, Sarah had turned 40 vehicles into burning wreckage. The road was impassable, blocked by destroyed trucks and craters. Supplies that were desperately needed by German frontline units would never arrive. Soldiers who had survived the attack would spend days trying to salvage what they could and clear the road. Sarah's radio crackled. Her squadron commander wanted a damage assessment. Sarah circled the scene carefully, staying high enough to avoid ground fire. She counted methodically. 27 trucks completely destroyed. 8 more heavily damaged and burning. 5 horse-drawn wagons obliterated. 2 armored cars knocked out. The remaining vehicles had scattered into fields and woods, abandoned by their crews. It was the most successful single attack by a lone fighter that her squadron had recorded. When Sarah landed back at base, her aircraft showed multiple hits from anti-aircraft fire. None had penetrated critical systems. The P-47 had lived up to its reputation for toughness. Sarah's mission report was brief and professional, but her squadron mates were amazed. One pilot destroying an entire convoy was unprecedented.
German units at the front were running out of ammunition during critical battles. Fuel shortages meant tanks and vehicles sat immobilized. Food supplies dwindled, affecting soldier morale and combat effectiveness. Medical supplies became scarce, leaving wounded soldiers without proper care. The Wehrmacht, which had perfected logistics during its conquest of Europe, was being strangled by its inability to move supplies the final 50 miles from depots to frontline units. German commanders initially believed the supply crisis was temporary. They assumed bad weather would ground American aircraft, allowing convoys to move freely. They thought tactical adjustments, like moving only at night or in small groups, would reduce losses. They hoped the Luftwaffe would eventually contest American air superiority and provide protection for supply columns. All of these assumptions proved false. American fighters operated in nearly all weather conditions. Night convoys were attacked by specially equipped aircraft. Small, dispersed groups took longer to deliver the same supplies, making the crisis worse. And the Luftwaffe never appeared in sufficient strength to challenge American dominance. By early July, the supply situation had become catastrophic. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had recently taken command of German forces in France, reviewed the logistics reports with growing alarm. His frontline divisions were operating at 30% of required supply levels. Armored units had fuel for perhaps 3 days of operations. Artillery batteries were rationing ammunition. Infantry divisions were on reduced rations. Medical units were running out of basic supplies like bandages and morphine. Von Kluge understood military operations at the highest level. He had commanded army groups on the Eastern Front and knew what properly supplied units could accomplish. He also knew what happened to units that ran out of supplies. They lost combat effectiveness, morale collapsed, and eventually they disintegrated as fighting forces. The reports from logistics officers painted a grim picture. Every major supply route was being interdicted by American fighters. Convoys that attempted daylight movement were being destroyed at a rate of 70 to 80%. Night movement reduced losses, but also reduced delivery capacity by half. The railway system, which should have been moving bulk supplies, was being systematically destroyed by heavy bombers and fighter attacks. Bridges were down, marshalling yards were cratered, rolling stock was burning in sidings across France. Von Kluge had fought the Soviets for years and had never experienced such complete disruption of logistics. The Eastern Front had been brutal, but supplies had generally reached frontline units. Now, in France, the supply system was simply collapsing under relentless air attack. Sarah Mitchell flew her second major mission on June 20th. This time, she was leading a flight of 4 P-47s on an armed reconnaissance sweep. Intelligence had identified a major German supply depot near Argenton that was feeding convoys to units fighting around Caen. Sarah's mission was to locate convoys leaving the depot and destroy as many as possible.
The search didn't take long. Sarah's wingman spotted the first convoy 20 minutes into the patrol. 12 trucks moving on a secondary road with what appeared to be a fuel tanker at the rear. Sarah made the tactical decision instantly. They would attack from different directions simultaneously, overwhelming any defenses. She gave quick orders over the radio, and her flight split into two pairs. Sarah and her wingman would attack from the north. The second pair would come in from the east 30 seconds later. The coordination was perfect. Sarah's attack run caught the convoy completely by surprise. Her guns tore into the lead trucks before they could react. Her wingman, flying close beside her, targeted vehicles in the middle of the column. The fuel tanker at the rear exploded in a massive fireball when armor-piercing rounds penetrated its thin armor. Burning fuel spread across the road, creating an inferno that engulfed several nearby trucks. The second pair of P-47s arrived exactly on schedule, attacking the panicked convoy from a different angle. Their combined firepower was overwhelming. Within 2 minutes, all 12 trucks were destroyed or burning. The pilots regrouped at altitude and continued their patrol. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah's flight would attack 5 more convoys, destroying over 60 vehicles total. They encountered anti-aircraft fire several times, but suffered no losses. The P-47's toughness proved itself again and again. Aircraft took hits that would have downed lighter fighters, but continued operating normally. One pilot returned with a hole the size of a basketball in his wing. Another had multiple hits in the engine cowling. Sarah's aircraft collected several strikes from 20mm shells that damaged control surfaces but didn't affect flight characteristics. When the flight landed back at base, the ground crews were amazed at the damage the aircraft had sustained. They were even more amazed that all 4 pilots had returned safely. The P-47's reputation for survivability was well earned. That evening, Sarah and her squadron mates gathered for debriefing. The intelligence officer was ecstatic. Their single 4-aircraft patrol had destroyed or damaged over 60 supply vehicles. Multiply that by the dozens of similar patrols being flown daily, and the cumulative impact on German logistics was staggering. The officer showed them reconnaissance photos taken after their attacks. The roads were littered with burning wreckage. Supplies were scattered across fields. German recovery teams were working frantically to clear roads and salvage what they could. The systematic destruction of German supply convoys was having effects that reached far beyond simple mathematics. Yes, the physical loss of trucks and supplies was significant, but the psychological impact was even more devastating. German soldiers at the front knew that resupply was becoming impossible. They couldn't count on ammunition arriving for the next battle. Fuel for their vehicles might not come. Food supplies were uncertain. This knowledge affected morale profoundly. Soldiers who believe they are being abandoned by their logistics system lose faith in their leadership and their cause. The Wehrmacht was experiencing this erosion of confidence throughout its ranks in France. German truck drivers, they abandoned vehicles at the slightest threat. The German supply system, which had functioned with Prussian efficiency during earlier campaigns, had devolved into chaos and fear. Logistics officers who had once moved millions of tons of supplies across Europe now struggled to deliver basic necessities to units just miles away. The German High Command in Berlin received daily reports about the supply crisis in France with increasing alarm. Adolf Hitler characteristically blamed his field commanders for incompetence and cowardice. He refused to accept that American air power had fundamentally changed the nature of ground warfare. Hitler's solution was predictable and useless. He ordered more supplies sent to France and demanded that convoy commanders show more courage. These orders ignored reality. The problem wasn't lack of supplies or lack of courage. The problem was that American fighters controlled the skies and were systematically destroying everything that moved on French roads. No amount of courage could protect a convoy from 8 50-caliber machine guns firing from a diving P-47 Thunderbolt. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell had become something of a legend in her squadron. Her confirmed kills of German vehicles had reached over 150. Other pilots sought her advice on attack techniques and tactical approaches. Sarah was generous with her knowledge, understanding that every pilot who became more effective would save Allied lives and hasten the end of the war. She emphasized several key principles that she had learned through hard experience. First, surprise was everything. Attack from unexpected angles and at unexpected times. Second, focus fire. Don't spray bullets randomly. Pick specific targets and destroy them completely. Third, stay aware. Always know where enemy anti-aircraft guns are positioned and avoid giving them easy shots. Fourth, trust your aircraft. The P-47 could take tremendous punishment. Don't panic when you take hits. Maintain control and complete your mission. These lessons were spreading throughout the American fighter squadrons operating over France. Pilots were becoming increasingly effective at convoy interdiction. Attack techniques were being refined and standardized. Intelligence was improving, with better information about German convoy routes and schedules. The cumulative effect was a steady increase in the destruction rate. By mid-July, German convoys attempting daylight movement faced nearly certain destruction. Even night movement was becoming increasingly dangerous as American pilots adapted their tactics for low-light operations. Some pilots learned to spot convoys by the dust they raised or the faint glow of shielded headlights. Others coordinated with ground observers who would mark convoy positions with flares or radio reports. The impact on German military operations was becoming catastrophic. The offensive that was supposed to push Allied forces back to the beaches had stalled completely. German armored divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Artillery batteries went silent because ammunition couldn't reach them. Infantry units dug defensive positions because they lacked the supplies necessary for offensive operations. Field Marshal von Kluge sent increasingly desperate messages to Berlin explaining that continued operations were impossible without. On July 23rd, Sarah led what would become one of the most significant missions of the campaign. Intelligence had identified a massive German supply convoy being assembled near Falaise. This wasn't a normal convoy. It was an all-out effort to resupply German armored divisions that were preparing for a major counterattack. The convoy consisted of over 200 vehicles, including fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and supply wagons carrying everything from food to spare tank parts. German commanders knew the risk, but felt they had no choice. Without this resupply, the counterattack would be impossible. They assigned maximum protection to the convoy. 20 anti-aircraft guns were positioned along the route. Fighter escorts were promised, though whether the Luftwaffe could actually provide them was questionable. The convoy would move in broad daylight, accepting the risk because the supplies were desperately needed. American intelligence, thanks to intercepted communications and reconnaissance photos, knew about the convoy before it departed. This was an opportunity too valuable to miss. High Command assembled a strike package that was unprecedented in scale. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from multiple squadrons would attack in coordinated waves. Sarah was chosen to lead the first wave, an honor that reflected her reputation and combat record. The briefing was detailed and comprehensive. Each wave would attack from different directions to maximize confusion and prevent the convoy from establishing effective defensive positions. The first wave would target the front and rear of the convoy, trapping it on the road. Subsequent waves would systematically destroy everything in between. Timing was critical. The attacks needed to be coordinated precisely to prevent friendly fire incidents and ensure maximum effectiveness. The strike force took off before dawn, assembling over the English Channel before heading toward France. Sarah flew at the head of the first wave, 12 P-47s in tight formation. They climbed to 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most ground fire and to give them energy for their attack dives. The morning was clear, with unlimited visibility. Perfect conditions for what American pilots called a turkey shoot. Sarah reviewed the attack plan one final time as they approached the target area. Her wave would dive from the northeast, attacking along the length of the convoy. Each pilot had been assigned specific target sectors to prevent overlap and ensure complete coverage. The convoy was exactly where intelligence had predicted, stretched out along a secondary road for nearly 2 miles. Sarah could see the vehicles clearly from altitude. Trucks, tankers, horse-drawn wagons, and armored cars in a long column. Anti-aircraft guns were visible at intervals along the convoy, their crews scanning the skies. Sarah checked her formation. All 12 aircraft were in position and ready. She gave the attack order and rolled into her dive. The P-47 accelerated rapidly as she plunged toward the convoy. At 5,000 feet, the anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Black puffs of flak began appearing around her aircraft. Sarah ignored them, focusing completely on her target. The lead vehicles of the convoy were growing larger in her gun sight. At 2,000 feet, she opened fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. Her guns tore into the lead trucks, setting them ablaze instantly. Behind her, the other 11
fuel tankers detonated with massive fireballs. Ammunition trucks exploded with such force that they created craters in the road. Sarah pulled out of her dive at 500 feet, her aircraft shaking from the turbulence created by explosions below. She looked back and saw the convoy erupting in flames along its entire length. The second wave was already diving, their guns adding to the destruction. The anti-aircraft guns were firing frantically but achieving little. The American attack was too fast, too coordinated, and too overwhelming. Sarah climbed back to altitude and circled the battlefield, observing the subsequent waves as they attacked. The third wave came in from the west, targeting vehicles that had tried to scatter into fields. The fourth wave attacked from the south, catching vehicles that had attempted to reverse direction and escape. Within 15 minutes, the massive German convoy had been completely destroyed. Over 200 vehicles were burning. The road was impassable for miles. Supplies worth millions of Reichsmarks were scattered across the French countryside or burning in massive pyres. The German counterattack that this convoy was supposed to enable would never happen. The armored divisions waiting for fuel and ammunition would sit immobilized while American forces continued their advance. Sarah's aircraft had taken several hits during the attack, but nothing critical. She led her wave back toward base, already composing her mission report in her mind. The intelligence officer would want detailed information about damage assessment and enemy response. High Command would want to know if the mission had achieved its objectives. Sarah knew the answer to that question already. The mission had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The largest German supply convoy assembled since D-Day had been annihilated in less than 20 minutes. When the strike force landed, ground crews counted the damage to the aircraft. Multiple aircraft had taken hits, some quite serious, but all 48 Thunderbolts had returned safely. Not a single American pilot had been lost. The P-47's reputation for toughness had been proven once again. The destruction of the Falaise convoy marked a turning point in the German supply crisis. After losing over 200 vehicles in a single attack, German logistics officers simply gave up on daylight convoy operations entirely. From that point forward, all supply movement would occur at night or not at all. This decision, while reducing losses, also reduced supply delivery capacity by more than half. German units at the front received a fraction of what they needed. Combat effectiveness declined rapidly. Soldiers went hungry. Wounded men died from lack of medical supplies. Tanks sat motionless for lack of fuel. Artillery pieces fell silent for lack of ammunition. The Wehrmacht in France was dying not from lack of fighting spirit, but from starvation of its logistics system. American pilots continued their relentless campaign against German supply lines. Night attacks became more common as German convoys shifted to darkness. Some pilots developed remarkable skill at operating in low-light conditions. They learned to spot convoys by the faint traces of movement against moonlit roads.
They coordinated with ground observers who would illuminate targets with flares at the critical moment. They used phosphorus markers to identify convoy positions for following waves of attackers. The adaptation was impressive and effective. German commanders who thought darkness would provide sanctuary discovered that American ingenuity had found ways to kill even at night. By early August, the cumulative toll on German logistics had become unsustainable. Records captured after the war revealed the staggering scope of destruction. Over 1,000 supply vehicles destroyed or damaged by American fighter attacks. Hundreds more abandoned due to lack of fuel or fear of air attack. Thousands of tons of supplies lost or captured. Entire German divisions reduced to combat ineffectiveness due to supply shortages. The Wehrmacht's carefully constructed logistics system had been systematically dismantled by young American pilots flying single-engine fighters armed with nothing more than 50-caliber machine guns. The simplicity of the weapon made the achievement even more remarkable. These weren't sophisticated guided missiles or heavy bombs. They were relatively simple machine guns, firing bullets. But in the hands of well-trained pilots, flying rugged aircraft with reliable engines, those simple weapons had achieved strategic effects. Sarah Mitchell flew her final combat mission over France on August 10th. By that time, she had personally destroyed or damaged over 200 German vehicles. Her confirmed kill count made her one of the most successful ground attack pilots in the theater. But Sarah never thought of herself as special or heroic. She was doing a job that needed to be done, using skills she had worked hard to develop, flying an aircraft she trusted completely. The real heroes, she believed, were the maintenance crews who kept the aircraft flying, the intelligence officers who provided targeting information, and the countless other people whose work made combat operations possible. Modern warfare was a team effort, and individual glory was less important than mission accomplishment. The systematic destruction of German supply convoys had effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German forces in France, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, were increasingly unable to resist Allied advances. The breakout from Normandy, when it came, faced weakened opposition that collapsed quickly. German units that might have fought effectively were instead retreating in disorder, abandoning equipment they couldn't fuel or operate. The famous Falaise Pocket, where tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped and captured, resulted partly from the inability of German forces to maneuver due to fuel shortages. Units that might have escaped were instead caught because they lacked the fuel to move their vehicles. American military analysts studying the campaign recognized that air interdiction of enemy logistics had proven decisively effective. The lessons learned over France would be applied in subsequent campaigns. The concept of using fighters for ground attack missions would be refined and expanded. Aircraft designs would incorporate features specifically for this mission. Training would emphasize ground attack skills alongside traditional air combat techniques. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially designed as a high-altitude interceptor, had found its true calling as a ground attack aircraft. Future designs would build on this success, creating aircraft optimized for destroying enemy ground forces and logistics. German military professionals, analyzing their defeat after the war, recognized the critical importance of logistics and the vulnerability of supply lines to air attack. Future German military doctrine would emphasize dispersed logistics, redundant supply routes, and the absolute necessity of air superiority before conducting major operations. The painful lessons learned in France would influence military thinking for decades. No modern army could operate effectively if its supply lines were being systematically destroyed by enemy air power. This fundamental truth, proven over the roads of France in the summer of 1944, would shape military operations for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Sarah Mitchell returned to the United States in late 1944. Her combat tour completed. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her exceptional service and her pioneering role as a female combat pilot. After the war, Sarah faced the same challenges many female pilots encountered. The military, reverting to peacetime policies, no longer wanted women in combat roles. Sarah could have become bitter about this treatment. Instead, she chose to focus on the positive. She had proven that women could fly combat missions as effectively as men. She had helped win the war. She had demonstrated courage and skill under fire. Those achievements could never be taken away, regardless of post-war policies. Sarah spent the rest of her life advocating for women in aviation and military service. She spoke at schools and air shows, telling her story and encouraging young women to pursue their dreams regardless of obstacles. She worked with veterans organizations, ensuring that the contributions of female pilots were recognized and remembered. She lived to see women finally accepted as combat pilots in the American military, a development she considered long overdue but deeply satisfying. When Sarah died in 2003, at the age of 82, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Fellow pilots, both male and female, spoke about her courage and skill. Young women she had mentored talked about her inspiration and encouragement. Military officials recognized her service and sacrifice. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolts campaign against German supply convoys represents more than just military history. It demonstrates how technological superiority, systematic training, and tactical innovation can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The German Wehrmacht was one of history's most effective military organizations, with years of combat experience and a tradition of excellence. Yet it was defeated not primarily by superior ground forces, but by the systematic destruction of its logistics through air power. This achievement required multiple elements working together perfectly. Aircraft that were tough enough to survive ground fire while delivering devastating firepower. Pilots trained to exceptional standards with hundreds of flight hours before entering combat. Intelligence services that provided accurate targeting information. Maintenance crews that kept aircraft operational despite harsh conditions. And commanders who understood how to employ air power strategically rather than just tactically. The .50 caliber machine gun, a relatively simple weapon, became the instrument of strategic victory when employed systematically against vulnerable logistics targets. This principle, using the right weapon against the right target in the right way, remains fundamental to effective military operations. Sophisticated technology isn't always necessary if simpler tools are used intelligently and persistently. The German generals, who couldn't believe American fighters had destroyed over 1,000 of their supply vehicles, learned this lesson the hard way. Their disbelief didn't change the reality. The trucks were destroyed, the supplies were lost, and their armies were starving. Belief was irrelevant when confronted with systematic, effective military force. The legacy of those summer months over France continues to influence military thinking today. Modern air forces study the campaign as an example of effective interdiction operations. The systematic destruction of enemy logistics remains a primary mission for tactical aircraft. The lessons about coordination, training, and persistent pressure are still taught to young pilots learning their craft. Sarah Mitchell and the thousands of other pilots who flew those dangerous missions over France proved that determination, skill, and the right tools could overcome any obstacle. They faced experienced enemy fighting on familiar terrain with desperation born of impending defeat. Yet they prevailed through systematic application of air power guided by clear strategic thinking. The story resonates beyond military circles because it demonstrates universal truths about human achievement. Success requires preparation meeting opportunity. Sarah's hundreds of hours of training prepared her for the moments of crisis when skill and judgment meant the difference between success and failure. Success requires the right tools for the job. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't perfect, but it was ideally suited for ground attack missions. Success requires persistence. One successful mission meant nothing. The campaign required months of continuous operations, flying mission after mission, regardless of weather, fatigue, or danger. And success requires teamwork. Individual heroics made good stories, but systematic victory required thousands of people working together toward common goals. The Germans never expected that American fighters, armed with 50-caliber machine guns, could destroy over 1,000 supply convoys and break the back of Wehrmacht logistics in France. Their expectations were based on outdated assumptions about air power's limitations and American military capabilities. Reality proved their assumptions fatally wrong. The Americans, combining technological advantages with systematic training and clear strategic thinking, achieved air superiority so complete that German ground forces couldn't operate effectively. This achievement, remarkable in its scope and impact, changed the course of the war and demonstrated principles that remain relevant decades later. The power of logistics, the vulnerability of supply lines, the decisiveness of air superiority, and the importance of systematic operations over individual heroics are all lessons validated by the campaign over France. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.